Tonight's Monday, January the 19th, 1976. We're about our last celebration of the bicentennial as far as interviews are concerned at the Drexel Hill Junior High School. We're pleased to have tonight reporters, two from the News of Delaware County and two from the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin. Suzanne, I would like you to start off, please, by giving your name and where you were born, where you were raised, where you were educated.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. My name is Suzanne Gordan. I'm a reporter with the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin. I was born in Newark, New Jersey, and moved around all over the country while I was growing up. I lived in New York State, Michigan, Illinois, and Georgia.
Was your dad in the service, or is that?
No, he wasn't. He works for the paper industry, so I'm sort of a paper brat as opposed to an army brat.
You mean as selling news or working for a newspaper?
No, he sells products to the paper industry. And I attended college at Randolph-Macon Women's College in Lynchburg, Virginia, and I studied Russian studies.
Russian?
Yes.
Great. Ed?
I was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey, grew up in Drexel Hill, went here to junior high school, Upper Darby High School, Temple University as a journalism major, and I'm currently managing editor of the News of Delaware County.
Forrest?
Yes, I'm Forrest Black, chief of the Bulletin Bureau that operates primarily out of Delaware County. I was born in Russell, Kentucky, and I grew up in Toledo, Ohio. Been in the newspaper business about 20 years now, and worked in Hawaii and Indianapolis, Evansville, Indiana, and for the past 13 years or so in Philadelphia.
Did you go to school to be a reporter?
Yes, well, it was a sort of a three-part journalism degree, which included political science, literature, and journalism.
Where did you go to school?
At the University of Toledo.
Isn't the Mecca, the University of Missouri, for your profession?
Not anymore. I think at that time, when I went to school 20 years ago, Missouri was highly rated. Of course, Columbia always has been, I think. Northwestern was frequently mentioned in the Midwest. I don't know which one is the most highly rated right now. I guess Columbia would be considered the most highly rated.
I'll tell you.
Okay, Joan.
You comment to that now.
I'm Joan Tennyson. I'm a reporter with the News of Delaware County. I was born in Bryn Mawr and grew up in the Upper Main Line area of Berwyn and Paoli. I went to the public schools in different Easttown. I went to Syracuse University, where I was a journalism, American studies, American literature major, and we consider Syracuse the Mecca of journalism graduates.
Oh, great.
I never heard of it.
Hey, good football team.
Yeah, right.
And I've been in the newspaper business for, I guess this is my 20th year.
Joan, did your education prepare you for this job?
My American Studies education prepared me for the government reporting. The journalism education prepared me for the flexibility of the newspaper business. But I don't think any of the schools try to tell you that it's going to put you right on the job, that every newspaper operates a little differently. And at Syracuse, you take a broad cross-section of newspaper, magazine, and media. At that time, they were just starting electronic media, so that you have some feel for all of it, but you have to get into it to do it. And I think that some of the best newspaper people today are still some of the people that never went to a journalism school, but have good savvy and good sense. So I don't think that you have to just be a journalism graduate. I think you have to have an instinct, and I think you really have to have printer's ink in your blood. And you don't have to go to school to get that.
Would you buy that, Joan?
Yeah, I would. I agree with that.
Did anything happen outstanding at your school that helped you become a journalist?
I wouldn't say at my school. I was lucky enough to have a summer job on a small weekly paper while I was in college. And
where was that?
That was in northern New Jersey, in a small town. And I think that was the the best experience that I had. I think a liberal arts education is a good idea, but I had no formal journalistic training, and I just sort of learned from people who were already in the business.
Ed?
Yeah, I agree with that, except more so. I think about 3/4 of the journalism courses I had in college are pretty much non-applicable to the journalism career that I've been involved in anyway in the last 10 years.
Something like educational courses, as far as teachers are concerned.
It could be, except you don't quite
get
get as much sand under your fingernails as you do in those. But yeah, I think I'd have been better off taking fewer journalism courses and more of other kinds of courses.
More liberal arts?
More liberal arts, yeah. I think so.
Forrest?
Well, I can't quite agree with any of the three totally. I think that the education does help considerably, particularly if you have journalism professors who know what they're talking about, of which we had some who had just been recently out of the newspaper business for a number of years, or had been in a number of years, and were good, solid news people. And the liberal arts, I totally agree with. I think that gives you a broad base that you may not always be aware of just how it's helping, but I think it does help you in journalism. But I suspect today even more than 15, 20, or 10 years ago that the higher education, provided the person applies themselves to it, would be very beneficial in any business, including journalism.
There's one thing I'd like to add. Even though that I think most of the people in the field would agree that there's a certain amount of on-the-job training you have to have, today many of your jobs are requiring a college degree and requiring a
You mean before they'll hire you?
Before they'll
Right.
hire you, which was unheard of, say, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. And not only are they requiring that, but they're requiring the journalism, either major or minor, but then they're requiring these broad majors in like either political science or government studies or something of that nature, so that even though you might feel that, well, there are good journalists that didn't go to college, that I think in the next 10 to 20 years
They won't even get a chance.
they won't even
Right.
get a chance. That the saga of the copy boy going in and moving up and becoming an editor is going to be a thing of
That's
the
over.
past.
Yeah. Well, that's true in education. It's a pity. There's a lot of smart people that don't have the qualifications, educationally wise, that have a lot to offer, but they won't get a chance. They wouldn't get a certificate.
Right.
Ed, what's the best criteria of a good reporter?
That's the best criteria of a good reporter?
Yeah.
Oh, that's an easy one.
I know he must have an awful lot of nerve.
Well, I don't
That's
know.
what I mean.
I guess nerve. You have to be an assertive person. You have to be unafraid to ask people questions, unafraid to deal with people. You have to be, I think, curious by nature, and I think you also have to have a feeling for people. If you can't really feel on one level emotionally involved with the people you're working with, I think it's harder to do a good job objectively with them, which might sound contradictory, but
Yeah, I don't
It's
understand that. How can you be objective if your emotions are involved?
well, I think the better reporters that I've had working for me have been the ones that have felt more compassionately and felt more close to the stories they were working on. Does that make it any clearer? That doesn't mean they wrote accordingly, but I think if someone gets a feeling of exactly what the people are writing about are feeling, that they're able to
You mean
report better.
they can vicariously put themselves into a person's...
Reporters are very vicarious people that way. Yeah, I think
Are they?
so. I think so. Yeah.
Would you add anything to that, Susanna?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that one of the important things is that you have to know either enough about the subject matter or know how to find out enough about the subject matter to know what questions to ask in order to get the story. And if you can put yourself in the person's position, or at least empathize with them enough to understand their problem, you might know what questions you would ask if you were in that situation. For example, if you're doing a story on taxes or a health problem, and if you could understand what that problem was, you would know what questions and what questions the people will have and how to answer them.
Joan?
I think one of the basic qualities of a good reporter is the intangibles, the integrity of the person. And I don't know how you define that. You can have somebody that's got good news sense but doesn't have integrity, and I don't think they make a good reporter, because they know a story but they don't know how to be factual about it. They don't know how to be honest about it. They don't know how to accept the responsibilities to verify their stories. And this is one of the reasons.
You mean they can't be lazy?
They
have to hustle and...
Yeah, you have to really be almost dogged after a story, because when you're in a situation of covering a news story, there are 4 or 5 other people probably covering it with you, and you could lay back and let them do all the legwork and then just share the fruits of their work. But a person that was a reporter with the integrity of the profession will do his own work, will be able to verify his own work, and will be able to stand by it. And this is something I think it's very hard. I think there are a lot of good editors that have very much difficulty picking these people out, and even the top-notch ones make mistakes when they pick staff members.
Forrest?
Well, I think Joan hit on a lot of it. Persistence would be, to me, the outstanding quality of a good reporter. Would be one who just keeps digging and digging away on complicated stories, and even some that are not so complicated. Sometimes you find that you have to keep going back to find out more about what went on, or some questions you didn't ask in the first place. You can't be afraid to go back and say, look, what about this? You know, I forgot to ask you, or simply just ask the question. You know, and until you nail it down, I find today that's probably lacking in more young reporters than anything else. It's just the willingness to dig in there and go after stories. Too much surface reporting.
Joan, does your press card entitle you to special information or courtesy?
Mine doesn't. From a standpoint of courtesy, we expect that as reporters that we're the observers on the scene, but we don't expect to be treated with any special treatment unless you look at the standpoint that from the standpoint that we expect to be included in governmental meetings where perhaps they say that this is a non-public meeting, but the press is invited because of the laws requiring that there be coverage.
The Sunshine Law?
Yes, that's one of them. But so many times when people think of privileges or courtesies to the press, they think of gratuities. Or
I didn't have that in mind.
You mean the ability to get into situations and to meet people? All right. Well, then definitely a reporter has an opportunity there, and I think the reporter probably has the privilege sometimes of meeting people that you might not, otherwise come in contact with. I know when I was a junior at Syracuse, our newspaper covered a World Affairs Council meeting downtown Syracuse, and Eleanor Roosevelt came. Now, that probably no other way would I ever been able to meet Eleanor Roosevelt.
That's right.
Other than the fact that I drew the slip for the reporter that day and was sent downtown. And at that time, Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't the big newsmaker that into the metropolitan papers as she had been. And I had like an hour and a half with her and was able to do quite an extensive interview with her, which. Even today, I enjoy going back and looking at. Had I not been a reporter, I wouldn't have had that opportunity.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I think reporters are able to have special privileges, but I also think at the same time that you have to, realize that you are in a position where you do have access to information, and sometimes you have to, realize that you may be prying into people's lives at certain times that may be difficult for them. For example, if you're covering a police story of some kind, or a story after a murder has taken place, you have to sort of take people's feelings into consideration, as to what they're going through at the time, and maybe sometimes finding other ways to get the same information just as well without sort of prying into people's lives when they're having difficult times. I know that writing obituaries had a big effect on me. I found it very upsetting at first because you'd have to call people right after people had died. But I think it's a terrific, as Joan mentioned, a terrific way to you know, experience things that you would never get to experience any other way.
Ed?
Yeah, I agree pretty much with what Joan and Susie have said so far. I think also that initially when I mentioned that thing about becoming emotionally involved, that was probably a poor choice of words. And I think what Susie just said then about having a feeling for what the people you're writing about are going through is more what I had actually intended to say, though it didn't really come out that way. I think that there are opportunities where reporters could gain privileges, and again, not gratuities, but privileges or privileged status. I think it's up to a reporter for a reporter to realize that where the line is drawn on something like that, and to deny him or herself that kind of opportunity when it's not appropriate, which is quite often.
I had a perfect example of that 2 years ago. I guess I had your daughter.
Right.
Or 3 years, whatever
3 years,
it was.
yeah.
Because Forrest's daughter was in my class, we got in to see the governor. I took my 2 8th grade sections to Harrisburg today. In fact, he wasn't in there, but if I hadn't had you, we would have never gotten in, because he said, this is not especially a quote, but what he meant is, you can make me or break me, and you can give me good press. And he wanted to be on the right side of Forrest. And I think people in public life, I think anyone, you people can either make them or break them.
Yeah, sometimes I think we don't realize just how much power there is there if you would desire to use it. I guess I never looked at it that way too much, but it's there. You just got to put yourself, I guess, in the politician's viewpoint or place, or think in terms of maybe if you were running for office, how valuable publicity would be to you, the right kind of publicity anyway, as opposed to the wrong kind. Yeah, right. The wrong kind will kill you. People tend to
that's what I meant by special
privileges.
You know, I better take care of Ed, because if he, he'll kill me.
Yeah.
Well, see, that's what I'm saying, that we shouldn't.
No, I didn't mean you personally. I meant your positions, all of you.
Yeah, but see, that's the kind of thing I think that the reporter shouldn't capitalize on. I don't think that we should hold it over our news sources that, well, if you don't cooperate with me, I can get you. I think this is one of the problems of the advocacy journalists of today, is that they proceed on that premise that, well, I'm out to get him if he doesn't do it my way, or come around my way, or make himself available at my beck and call. And I think that this all ties in with the integrity of the journalist. I think that you have to know where your role is and what your responsibilities are. But I don't think you should capitalize on any kind of a misguided power position that some reporters think they have. And I think that this is one of the things that's given journalism, given the media a bad name today. Is that if you look at your polls, you look at your ratings, the news media has as bad a credibility problem as some of our government officials.
I'm not aware of that.
Well, it is a case, and it's a situation that. The reason you're not aware of it, unfortunately, is because the press hasn't been as dogged at reporting that as they have been reporting the low public opinion of politicians.
Well, don't you think that since Watergate, I mean, if it wasn't for reporters, how long would this go along without all this dishonesty in government? And I'm sure there's dishonesty in everything, in all levels of government. And I don't know exact words that Jefferson said, but if he had to have the two,
yeah,
he would certainly go with the press, and I would too. I think you people are guardians of a society. I really do. And,
well, I think we have to be, but I also think that with that responsibility of being the guardians of the public's freedom, we have an even greater responsibility to not abuse that.
No, I think you misread what Mr. Kane said, though. I don't think anybody
abusing it. Do you think anybody abused Watergate?
Well, I think some of the fallout from Watergate has been abused by the press. I think the press, I've had attorneys say to me, and a few politicians, that the two reporters that broke the Watergate story, Woodward and Bernstein, should have been jailed because they tampered with a grand jury. Now, there's another side to the right of the press to gain information, but does it give them the right to gain information at all costs? There's some feeling that perhaps that the press has this right to gain the information, but they also have a certain amount of legal hindrance, or however you want to look at it, that they have to work within. And as a result of the Watergate, sure, you were able to open up a lot of channels of government that would never have been opened without it. Right. Granted, but I think that there is also some value in looking at have not there been other abuses by some less responsible press because of people using that as the prime example of what can be done, and have they misused this privilege and this courtesy that the press has? And I, for one, feel that there are examples where we as a profession have misused it.
Forrest, any comment?
Well, I don't think it's quite as serious as Joan would have you believe. I think there are individuals from time to time that do abuse the privilege and the right of the free press. Certain editors from time to time that go overboard. But I think by and large, if you compare it to almost any other group or profession, I think they're very highly rated in that area of using what power, authority, whatever they may have with the proper discretion.
Ed?
No, I'm not so sure of that. I'm not even so sure that's the case on Watergate. I think Nixon was guilty, and they found out he was guilty. But I think a lot of people went after Nixon assuming he was guilty before there was any proof that he was guilty of anything. They just happened to hit something in Nixon. They found somebody that had done a lot that was clearly wrong. But I think a lot of people went after Nixon in an unfair way, even though people like Woodward and Bernstein hit stuff. A lot of people were just out to get him because they didn't like the man.
Just because they didn't like him, that the question is whether the material was presented factually or not.
Physical intuition.
Oh, there was no question. A lot of reporters didn't like Richard Nixon. I didn't like him, for example. But the question is whether their stories were factually accurate or generally, and whether they led to the desired consequence of exposing Watergate, which I think they did, which I think most of them were probably fairly accurate considering the circumstances in which they had to operate. That is, they sometimes had to use anonymous sources and so forth.
And a lot of times, if they didn't have a complete story, they made up parts of it. If you go back...
Well, I don't know that for a fact.
You go back and you look at some of the international UPI and the news services and the Los Angeles Times Service and New York Times Service, and compare stories coming out of apparently the same sources, and they weren't alike, because it had gotten to a point in the Nixon coverage where everybody figured there was such a dislike for Nixon you could get away with saying anything. And I really agree with Ed that I think that the original intent of Watergate was much more to get the Watergate reporting was much more to get Nixon than to find out the facts. I seriously doubt in a lot of papers whether, had the facts come out differently, had they not trailed to the White House and had they not been Nixon, whether there had ever been a Pulitzer Prize, even though these people worked as hard and probably did just as good a job and maybe found somebody else. And I think that this is one thing. I think in time the press is going to have to stand trial in the educational circles for that particular way of handling. And this is why I say I think a lot of this is carried over into other relationships of the press with government, because it's a very, very powerful thing. And if you can very subtly say to a news source, hey, look it, either you give it to me, or if you don't give it to me, I'll use an unidentified source. And a lot of people, as a result of Watergate, are so terrorized by that they'll cower to it. And I think that I hope it's, and I don't feel it's by and large the majority of the press, but I think there are enough people doing it that we in the profession ought to be concerned about it and should be alert to it, and should when we see it happening, call it out and make it a visible thing to the rest of us in the press, so that we can be our own guardians. Because if we don't, I think from what I've been reading in the last 4 years, if we don't clean our own house where it has to be, there's going to be governmental influence, and that
censorship then.
And that I think is worse, because the bureaucracy that we're trying to wade through and to clean up, if they ever got started on the press, I don't think we'd ever publish on time, because it would be just sheer chaos.
I can't believe you sat through or seen all the Watergate hearings, the days and weeks and months of corruption that came out of those hearings, and what was written about it, and make some of the statements you make, Joan. They amaze me, frankly. Nixon, whether you liked him or loved him or hated him aside, I mean, the evidence is so compelling and overwhelming in the case of Watergate, of political corruption of all kinds, that everything I've ever read in the metropolitan press in the East, in Washington or New York or Philadelphia, was, from what I could see, pretty much right down the line, was documented all along the line as the facts came out. I don't know where you or Ed get your information, that people went to sources and said, look, we'll print this if you aren't willing to be identified, we'll use an unidentified source. Do you have factual information to back up that kind of statement?
You're saying after the fact, Forrest, and I'm saying before the fact, before Watergate came out. When Watergate came out, when they started unfolding, naturally the reporters and the media were working with facts, and we're working with a lot of it, and there was no question with the reporting. But before that came out, before the reporting that was going on before that, there was a lot of innuendo, and there was a lot of, I think, misreporting, because people thought that they had judged him ahead of time.
Well, that was in '72, right? Just after the break-in, and they thought, oh, my goodness, we misjudged this poor man, let's elect him in November '72. And then we found out about a year later, as the events transpired, that just about everything they'd written in one form or another was not only accurate, it was inaccurate, because it wasn't nearly as bad as what the facts actually showed.
Yeah, but don't you think that we found that out just about the time that some of the people that wrote those stories found it out? I mean, I think it's sort of a Machiavellian attitude. That it turned out that the guy was worth busting, so anything we did to bust him was justifiable, and I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, I think you're right that a lot of people in the press didn't like Nixon and still don't. But I think the proof of the pudding still is whether the stories were accurate and factual or not, whether you like the man or not. As you were talking about the human side of news coverage earlier, the emotional side, you can't help but like or dislike a person to a certain degree. There's always some factor there. But the question is whether you report accurately and fairly what went on.
Joan, do you have any comment on that?
No, I don't think so. It wasn't covered.
Well, I'd like to change one number. I disagree with Forrest on one number he mentioned when he said that the reporting like that of Nixon began in 1972. I would amend that to put a 5 where the 7 was.
No, I said that was when the break-in occurred.
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is I think the press went after Nixon beginning in 1952.
Well, I remember
which I think we'll all agree was before the Watergate burglary.
Before you remember, I remember his checker speech.
Oh, no, I remember.
Oh, I remember that.
You must have been a good student if you remember that.
Well, I had activist parents.
Joanne, this leads very nicely into the next question. Can you be objective when your emotions are involved? We've hinted on it before, but can you give me a yes or a no answer to that? I mean, when you're...
Can I be objective when my emotions are involved?
Yeah. If you dislike this person, can you give him an objective press coverage? Or if you think this person is wonderful, can you be objectively in your writings?
I'll have to say yes.
You can.
Based on the fact that I think your emotions are always involved, but I think that you need to have somebody check your information or check your stories, just to look at someone who perhaps doesn't know the person, doesn't know the story.
If you dislike a person, won't you go more out of your way to get something into the story that you dislike them?
No, I think maybe the tendency would be in the opposite
Would it?
direction.
Okay.
Because you would be so aware of that fact that you might overcompensate and maybe
Okay.
not be as hard as on the person as you really should be.
You buy that, Ed?
Sure, you can like someone and not endorse them for election in an editorial, or you can dislike someone and endorse them.
And we
I
have.
know because I have.
Forrest?
Yes, but I think all that's true, and I always try to do it. But I think that the smart politicians or people who deal with the press and the public, they know that if you can sit down and have a cup of coffee with them and relax and chat and so forth,
Right.
that gives them an edge. And I think in most cases it does.
Well, I have more respect for a politician who will really complain and get angry when they don't like something I did than someone who tries to be nice to me all the time.
Well, I think in teaching, if a kid does something that's wrong, that I would bend over backwards, like you said, to make sure that I didn't be nasty to him.
Yeah, I think that's human nature.
How much, Suzanne, how much does your stories get changed when you write them and give them into the paper?
Once in a while.
Does that annoy you? And why are they changed?
It doesn't annoy me unless a story, which may be poorly written or could be better written, is changed and the facts are changed due to someone's error. That annoys me because it looks as though I didn't report something accurately. If something's changed for the better in terms of style or readability or the lead, the beginning of the story is changed to make it more readable, that's fine with me. I like to be corrected. I think you need the constant challenge and criticism. I think that's the only way you improve.
Ed, are you the person that changes stories?
Yeah. I don't
Can you be
change.
objective with that question then?
Sure. I don't change any. Excuse me. I don't change. See, we're in a little different situation. Let me preface it by saying that Susie's in a position sometimes where she'll phone a story into a desk person 20 miles away, and they'll work on it without being in touch with her. I'm in a position where usually the person that wrote the story is within 20 feet, whether I like it or not. And I never make changes of any significance in hard news stories without consulting with the people and seeing what they think of it. I think it's better to do it that way because they know what they're writing about more than I do. I might make some style changes, change a capital or lowercase, but I won't change an intent of a lead or even change a lead in any way without talking to the person that's written it. I also like to, on page one stories, go over the headline I've written for them with the reporter that did the story, because I think we have a better chance of getting it accurate and getting it the way the reporter intended it to be that way.
Is that true?
Let's see now. If I say yes, then
Measure
I never
your
again can
words.
holler, and if I say no.
Well, no, being that I'm the editor, I have the right to change whatever you say.
Yeah. Now, generally, that's true with it. I have worked for some editors that take the attitude that they have to make some change in every story, regardless of what you do with it. And I don't care what they do. I try not to let it bother me what they do to change a story, provided they retain the accuracy. I feel the way Susan does in that, because I make a great effort to be accurate. I probably go to more lengths to be sure I have the information right than I do sometimes to worry about the style or the to be cute or to be different.
How many E's an employee?
Or even sometimes my spelling. But if they change my facts on me, it really bothers me, because all we have is our accuracy.
It's your name.
That's right.
It's not Ed's name.
Yes, they don't put my editor's name on the stories. And when I used to do the football coverage, I did a lot of sports reporting when I was in college, and then when I first worked for the local news in Westchester.
Who was the big fullback up at Syracuse then?
Jim Brown was
Jimmy
in my
Brown.
class.
Okay.
That's my family's claim to fame, is that Joan graduated with Jim Brown.
That's a whole other tape.
Not that I graduated or even went through school or worked my way through, but that I would walk
Right.
the line. He was my partner in the graduation
great.
line. So of course, that's all my brothers and sisters remember. But when we worked, and I first went to work for the local news in Westchester, I turned in a sports story, and the sports editor at that time didn't think a woman knew anything about sports reporting. And so obviously took my story and changed it. So you told him
you knew Jim Brown?
No, I didn't. This was before. This was when this was the year before, but I had done a sports story and...
Well, there's conflicting reports on that time in Joan's life. We can't seem to really piece it together to our satisfaction.
And he was so sure I didn't know what I was doing on this particular story that he changed it. I don't even remember now how, but I do remember the commotion afterwards. And I went into the office and said to him, how could you do this? I was working out of a regional office like Susan and Forrest do, and it was a story that was sent over a machine to them. And he said, well, I didn't think you knew what you were talking about. And so from then on, whenever I put a sports story, I used to put at the end, I know what I'm talking about.
Forrest?
Well, sometimes, of course, I found it true at the Bulletin. Most of the time I've been there, from time to time we might have a weak desk, a few people on the desk that are really not that strong, but generally, and a lot of editors have had many years in the business, and sometimes you can always learn from almost anybody, and particularly some of the people we've had at the Bulletin have been very helpful, I think, to all reporters. Sometimes you don't think that they're helping you very much when they change the story. Of course, obviously they shouldn't change the facts. But, of course, some reporters sometimes don't always get the facts right. Some editors have been around long enough so that they even know, without having been out there to cover that story, that something in the story is wrong factually. And so they can be very beneficial. They can also be irritating at times when they drop parts of your story for space reasons or whatever, or they get somewhat vicious. And so there's been some real bad examples of that. I'm sure every reporter's run into them. I'd say for the Bulletin, they're very, I probably learned how to write better in the business at the Bulletin than any other paper by far than I'd ever worked for. We had many reporters, and still have some today, that are just top rank people in their field of writing as well as reporting, who I've learned a lot from.
To follow up that question, what is the difference between a good reporter and a mediocre reporter?
Well, I mentioned earlier persistence. I think a lot of it revolves down to that. I think that probably most people in the business, especially when they get to a daily metropolitan paper level, but of course obviously in many other papers of all kinds, but once they get to a certain level and have had a few years, they have the technical competence, the intelligence, the training to do the job. It's just a matter, to a great extent, of just hard work, the persistence, just going after and getting down and doing the job and persisting. Of course, with some, it's a matter of if you have the right editor who likes you or doesn't like you. That's always, human factors always play a part in any business, and that, or you may just get lucky and fall into the certain kind of story that
appeals,
projects you into the limelight. Yes.
Susanna, James Reston means much to me. What would your chances be if you had the desire to end up, I would think the best newspaper would be the New York Times? I'm putting my opinion in there.
I have time for rebuttal.
On the behalf of the News of Delaware County?
No.
If you had a desire, what would make it possible for you to end up whatever you consider the best paper in the United States?
How would I get there?
Yes.
Is that what you're asking? It's a good question.
Is it luck? I mean, Forrest said there's a much luck about it. If you happen to appeal to the right person.
I don't know. In fact, I asked that question to a woman I met a few months ago who is a reporter for the New York Times. Not for myself, just because I was curious, how do you get a job in the New York Times? And her answer was, it was Eileen Shanahan, who works in the Washington Bureau. And she said, like anything else, you have to be at the right place at the right time. And she said, everyone who gets a job there gets a job through a different process. You either you know somebody, either you walk in off the street and just happen to hit it off, right? So I don't know. I mean,
That's a good enough answer. Yeah. Ed, do you have any comment on that?
Well,
You don't have to like the New York Times.
well, I think the New York Times is the most thorough paper in this country. I also think it has a definite ideological bias. I think it's pretentious. I think it's stuffy, and I think it's poorly written. I think a paper I was reading, an article I was reading in the paper that I consider to be the best American paper,
What's
the
that?
Wall Street Journal this morning, was about journalism jobs and getting to places like the New York Times and things like that, and how you would get to the New York Times from where we are right now, aside
if you wanted to.
if you wanted to, would be probably not at all. I think it said that they hired about 10 reporters last year. Don't plan to hire quite that many this year.
Would they come up from the ranks, or would they come out of journalism school?
They in no cases do they come out of journalism school. They have practically a policy against that, against hiring people right out of journalism school now. The topic of the article was the way that the journalism market's been glutted by the amount of reporters coming out of the schools, and the jobs just aren't there. Probably someone that goes to work at the Times would be, like was being said, if they knew someone, or if they were coming from, well, I don't know, wherever, the Washington Post or the LA Times or some paper of almost comparable magnitude. For one of, I don't think there's too much upward mobility in the journalism profession these days.
Anything to add to that? My next
Sure.
question. Go ahead.
I just had one other thought. This woman from the New York Times had told me that she said, you know, if you specifically ever want to work for the New York Times, she said this would be my advice: get your name on as many important stories as you possibly can.
And send them in to them?
No, just have your name on the stories, and eventually somebody up there is going to see your
I
name,
see.
which seems sort of like a slow, obscure process.
Joan, how much control does the owner of a newspaper have over what you write and what subjects you write?
Well, in our case, none. I think it depends when there is control, and I think that type of situation is almost non-existent.
All over?
I think pretty much today. There are exceptions, but I think mostly the owners are so busy trying to make money that there's not the day-to-day hand in the pie type of situation. Now, I know in one of the city papers about 10, 15 years ago that the owner had a few fights with a few of the news sources in the community, and they were told they couldn't report on them. Well, that type of thing, though, today I don't think is quite as, if it's going on. I'm certainly not familiar with it in this area. I try to keep up on some of the journalism quarterlies and the various reports and studies done on journalism and how it's controlled or how it's handled or how it's managed. And I think that most of them agree that this isn't the situation today. On weeklies, I think there can be that. There is more of an opportunity for that kind of control because
You can be selective.
the weeklies. Well, the weeklies are usually are close. The owner is closer to the product. It's not in many cases. Now, in our case, we were owned by a chain, but I know there are some weeklies in Pennsylvania that are the owner is also the editor. So there you might have the conflict of what I put in, is it going to affect my advertising and stuff. I think that most papers today are much more professional than that. But I don't deny it probably happens someplace. It doesn't happen with us. If anything, we have
do your own thing.
We have a great deal of editorial freedom as far as reporting and coverage and what we feel are stories. And
Forrest?
Well, not too much. Of course, libel plays a part, and in the series of stories that we did a couple of years ago, it played a big part, and we've continued to do some stories in the areas of governmental corruption in this county particularly, as well as other places, as best we can, limited by manpower and so forth, but there is a certain limiting factor in terms of how far you can go, even in attacking or criticizing or pointing out alleged corruption with respect to public figures. Now, when you're talking about private figures, people in private industry and so forth, what's involved there, I think, is most newspapers don't report that at all to any extent. They mainly just report what happens in the governmental fields and related areas and so forth, so that it's like a self-imposed, not censorship, but a self-imposed, hands-off kind of thing. If you get into the area of the bankers and so forth from time to time, as I have, you'll find out that some editors and some publishers don't like it. That's right. And if you get in there too often, you'll certainly have a battle. I happen to get some stories in, but it was made clear to me in so many ways that they didn't care too much for it.
Is that recently?
No, that was several years ago when I was still covering the legislature. So that, and you know, that's not very shocking. The papers they're a two-headed kind of thing. I mean, they're the guardians of the press, of the freedom.
They make money too.
And they have to make money to exist, so that anytime you really get close to the sources of their income, just like anything else, they're going to be unhappy about it.
Right.
But I don't think it's a continuous battle and struggle between the reporters and the hierarchy.
Ed, any comment on that?
No, only to add that I think a notable exception to the general lack of that kind of control, probably on a daily basis, that some people might know of, is the Manchester Union leader in New Hampshire, which is somewhat to the right of Alexander the Great.
Oh, right, right.
And
You either do what he says or I'll bet you walk.
Yeah, well, if you come out with both legs, you walk. Otherwise, some other form of travel may be more suitable. But there have been some examples on local levels of that kind of control in recent years. The Mainline Chronicle, when I worked over
that
Uncle Ben.
Uncle
Yeah, well,
Ben.
he no longer owns that, but there was a time when he and his wife used to rewrite leads of reporter stories, reporters that I knew, to get the kind of slant they wanted into it, little regard for facts.
Bet you they look for new jobs quickly, didn't they?
The reporter, the one that I'm talking about, did, yeah.
I would say most would.
He wasn't real pleased with that.
Susanna, any comment? There's been I'm asking a question about, has there been a court decision on whether a reporter has to release his source of information? I know that was quite very
Well, it's been a
important.
battle in recent years. There have been a number of
Has there been a decision
court-
on it that you have to give your
There
source?
was one, I think, recently that, and I frankly don't remember the state involving
It was the Supreme Court of the United States,
Yeah,
I think.
right.
Well, the Supreme Court is still ruling
Oh,
on
they
whether or
haven't.
not it's been appealed. There have been, in the last, I guess, 5 years, there have been something like a dozen reporters that have spent time in jail rather than reveal their sources. There have been other reporters who have decided that, well, the information I have is not of the magnitude that it's a problem with me, so I'll make it available, and so that a dozen isn't the only number that's been called in. But they have not gotten a definitive legal opinion that's going to hold up. And I don't remember, I think it's the Los Angeles Times case, but there's somebody is now getting ready to argue in the Supreme Court. And the basis that they're going to try to use is the fact that the reporter's notes are no different than the television, the television film, and they've now been able to subpoena television film, so they feel they should be able to subpoena reporters' notes. And I think it's going to, if they do rule in favor of allowing that material to become, have access to it, I think it's going to change the whole way of reporting, because people that now use notes may go to electronic and take tapes and then destroy the tapes after they finish with them, which I would hate to see, because I think sometimes that your notes are valuable as background later.
Of course, in my case of my notes, you couldn't read them anyway. So it wouldn't make any
Turn
difference.
those over.
Turn them over to anybody.
Yeah.
Then you'd have members of the media using tapes and destroying them so that the government people couldn't hear their tapes.
Yeah.
Well, I think the problem is that if you say you had vital information that related to a murder, for example, and yet you claim the privilege of freedom of the press, and I've always sort of felt that unless there's some compelling reason why you couldn't release that information, you certainly should release it in a murder case if it was vital to the state's case, the prosecution's case. So it seems to me there's some cases where clearly the information should be turned over, and as a general rule, it should not. I mean, you know, because you do have people that talk to you that would not reveal their anything to you unless they were assured of confidentiality. But as far as taking written notes, not only can't they read mine, but you could you just go to the orally, get your information that way, and then still you'd have to check out factual situations probably from time to time.
Susanna, do you choose or you assign what you report on?
Well, in my case, it's a little of both. Much of what I cover involves Upper Darby. That's my more or less beat, as you would call it.
That's why you're here.
That's why I'm here. Yeah.
But what goes on in Upper Darby do you choose?
Right, pretty much. What goes on, I am usually the person at the Bulletin who's in touch with the township officials, and it's more or less my responsibility to keep up on what's happening here and several other boroughs in the county. Other things which are sent directly to the main office or to Forrest, being the bureau chief, would be assigned from either him or the editors downtown. It would just more or less depend on what type of story it was and what part of the county was affected by it.
Can you choose what you wish to report on?
Yes, pretty much, and can choose what the Bureau, as a general rule, wishes to report on, because after all, the people downtown,
they don't know what's going on.
They really don't, and they don't really care that much as long as you're producing stories day by day and filling the pages and so forth. Now, if it was a vacuum, they'd move into it. In other words, if the Bureau wasn't producing, then they would...
They'd get somebody to take your place.
Either that, or they'd start making sure that you started producing stories, or they'd tell you what they wanted done. You know, they'd just dream up anything just to get you moving, I guess.
Ed?
Oh, I can do just about whatever I want to do.
That's because you...
Yeah.
Right.
That's just because of the type of guy you are, right, Ed?
No, it's in spite of the type of guy.
Are you assigned or do you choose what you write?
Primarily, we're assigned areas, and then it's up to us to...
What is your area?
Cover that area. Well,
The Western Hemisphere.
right now, it's sort of a mishmash of Upper Darby Township, Haverford Township, county government, county courts, the environment.
This goes from murder to politics, anything that you want?
No, I don't do police beat. I don't do the police anymore. When I was covering Haverford as a correspondent rather than a reporter, I did the police over there too. But we found that it's better to have one person doing the police in our areas.
And you get continuity.
To having a police reporter, so they knows the similarities in the various departments and knows what other police stories there are this week, so he knows which things that would be news this week and which is old hat, and that's one reason why we started assigning dual and triple townships to one reporter, so that we could get some kind of a comparison as to the reporting on government. If I had more time, I would do some sports reporting, but I haven't been able to figure out how to get that time. So.
Susanna, has television, in your opinion, increased the interest in newspapers, or is it taken away? I'm sure that's a subjective question.
Right. Well, based on studies I've read, I think that you'd have to say that it's taken away. And the pace that I know that I keep up and many people I know keep up, I don't think that generally people have much time to spend reading newspapers at any great length. I think the television is a great way to find out what's happening in a very simplified form.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because that's how I feel. Ed?
Well,
how about television? Is it good or bad?
It's bad.
Bad.
Well, I think you have to remember that the people that do the announcing are sort of like stick figures who are entertainers.
Somebody does the work. And
yeah, someone does the work, and the overall work of broadcast media reporters is far inferior to the overall work of print. And I'm not just saying that because I'm in the print media, although it must sound that way. All I can say is that the only stories that I've ever seen covered on television that pertain to our area, I cannot recall a case in which it was done completely accurately. There's always been a distortion or a factual error or something like that. I just don't take television news seriously at all. I prefer the Honeymooners. I think that's a more accurate reflection of American life than, say, Walter Cronkite.
Well, that's true. I think I have an even lower opinion, if that's possible, than Ed does.
No, it's not.
Of television news.
I'm sorry, you can't have a lower opinion.
I can't top you on that one. They are pretty bad, and it's sort of disgraceful. Actually, some of the people in television are fairly intelligent people, but I guess it's just the system itself just does not lend itself to
Yeah, but they're all doing Sesame Street.
to any kind of real reporting of what's going on in the world. I really would disagree on Susan there. I don't think that even in a simplified way that she can find out what's going on. Well, the national networks are a little better, obviously, than the local news, but so there I think you can get a little better, some idea
That's
what's
what
going on in the world.
Really.
But in the local news, I don't even think you can get a halfway decent briefing on what's going on, really. There, I think you're just lost. I think the schools, I guess it's been written many times today, and the whole thing that kids are not learning to read and write, and I think that's really the biggest factor, not necessarily that TV turns them off or that they don't have the time to read and write anymore. I think it's just they don't want to do it.
That's the easiest thing to do.
It's the easiest thing is just to watch the TV.
Would you want to add anything?
No, you're not going to like what I'm going to say.
That's all
because
right.
I think that television is the problem, and doesn't serve at all. I think that it deludes people into thinking it's giving them news, so they feel comfortable and they don't read the news.
You mean you're not condemning all television? You're just condemning news reporting.
I'm pretty close to condemning all television. I think that people use it as a crutch, and I think that Forrest talks about the fact that people aren't reading and writing, and I think that...
No, wait a minute. I just can't. I have to interrupt you. What was better for me watching the Super Bowl in my living room, watching everything with the replays and everything, than reading your story of it?
Well, first of all, I don't think you were watching everything, because you were watching a very narrow view that they were giving you, and they were getting 4 or 5 shots from 4 or 5 different vantages, and somebody sitting upstairs who had superimposed his thought on what makes a good football television report was picking out the scene that you were going to see.
Well, wouldn't I be reading your report?
I think that within the limitations of human ability to transmit that from Miami to your home, perhaps television is good for sports entertainment, and I like to watch it probably. My only time that I feel that television serves me is when I'm watching sports, within the framework of knowing that I'm not seeing everything. And in baseball games, I'm probably not seeing the best part of the game, because when I go to a ball game, I spend a great deal of time watching the pitcher and the catcher interplay and the manager and the coaches interplay, and I rarely see that on television. But as far as the news side of it, I had a sister in Vietnam, and I know from her that Vietnam was not covered by the major networks. So that I think just from that story, that the national news misreporting of Vietnam, I can imagine what they're doing to the little stories. So I feel that I hope in our generation and my children's generation that we get back to reading. And I think the only way we're going to get back to reading the newspapers is for our newspapers to remember that we have a job to do to go back to news and get away from some of this magazine style of trying to compete with the television. That we have to go back to reporting what's going on rather than dissecting it and making a magazine out of our newspapers. But I don't think that the television is serving us at all as far as news.
Susanna, is it true, this is perhaps a cliche, that newspapers are owned by Republicans, but people that work for them, the reporters, are Democrats?
That's a loaded question, I think.
Is that true?
I don't know whether you can generalize about anything like that. I wouldn't want to venture to.
Do you want to comment on that?
I certainly wouldn't know. I think that's impossible to say.
I think most don't are Republicans, that's true.
I remember that reading this, now I don't know if it's a truth or not, that 80% of the press is controlled by big business, but most of the reporters were anti-Republican.
Yeah, I think a majority of reporters are Democrats or liberals, more accurately.
Well, that's
are liberally oriented in their younger years, and then as they go along, I think some of them change like everybody else does.
I only have a few more minutes. A couple questions I want to get in. Have any of you ever been threatened by a story?
By a story?
That you have written?
You mean
bodily?
intimidated? Oh, most certainly.
Sure.
Have you, Forrest?
Yeah, there have been attempts.
Have any of you ever been asked to print something and received a reward for it, or offered a reward?
Yeah, I've been offered a smattering of a bribe or two and could hardly figure it out.
No, I don't recall that happening.
No, I haven't. Sometimes it's a subtle kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it's
Oh, sometimes lawyers
Yeah.
years ago in Indianapolis at the courthouse, they used to offer you $10 to get their name in a paper in connection with a case or something. It was kind of a mild form of attempted bribery, but nevertheless.
have any of you ever been threatened with a court case for anything you've written?
I haven't.
I've been threatened, but I think people like to threaten you that way.
Some politicians like to use that ploy that I'll sue you if you
Yeah.
if you pursue that line
Yeah.
of questioning, hoping to scare you off.
I'll have to end it up with this last question, if you could be as brief as possible. And I had more, but we only have an hour. Should there be more self-restraint in reporting? I'm going to give you a specific. I don't think anyone in our area would have ever been tempted to sniff glue if it wasn't a great big article in the newspaper about how they did it in California. Should a thing like that be withheld voluntarily, Susanna? Assuming my
yeah.
statement is true.
Yeah. I think there are times when things, you can put things in people's heads, and I'm not sure that, I know when they were talking about the Liberty Bell last week, they went out and were interviewing people, other historical shrines, and saying, you know, are you afraid your shrine's going to get blown up? You know, and I think maybe that's just sort of perpetuating ideas that may not necessarily ever, you know, come across in anyone's mind.
I think the fact that it is reported isn't as important as the fact that it's generally done in a faddist manner, which to some extent makes it seem attractive, or at least unorthodox and unconventional, and thus appealing to a certain kind of person.
Forrest?
Well, I think there's a certain liberal bias there that has been somewhat harmful, sort of a weight of being pro-drugs. I happen to be